Welcome, everybody. We'll be starting the session shortly, just waiting for a few folks to trickle in. Hope everyone's doing well. And there we go. So we're here to talk about how to meet with your MP about public transit. We're going to start off with some political context from my colleague Nate. Nate Wallace, our program manager of clean transportation and environmental defense, will tell you a bit about public transit funding, why, again, now is a great time to get involved and join the movement and speak up for this. Then we'll talk a little bit about some guide materials and some tips for how to meet with your MP, how to set up the meeting, why it's actually not that scary, and it's a great way to just meet someone who represents you and your community. And then we'll hear from some special guests who are on the call as well. Many of you know Shelagh Pizey from TTC Riders, and David Cooper of Leading Mobility is joining us as a special guest as well. Both have a lot of insights to share about advocacy and meeting specifically with elected officials about public transit. Then we'll open it up to some questions, and then there's going to be a form that you can fill in to sign up, and we can help team you up with other people in your riding to set up these meetings for with your MPs. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Nate.
Thanks a lot, Felix. I mean, I can't see everyone else, but that's okay. Why it's really important that to talk to your MP now is, especially when it comes, it's the federal government. It's not just your local city. It's not just your province. It's the federal government. Is the federal government involved in transit? Yes. Right now, the federal government is renegotiating major infrastructure funding deals that are cost shared between provinces and the federal government, and also between the federal government, provinces, and cities. And a lot of these infrastructure funding programs deal with public transit. So having our voices heard now really matters. Could go back to slides. So yeah, keep on the slide for a second. And it's because of this context that we recently released a report called Putting Wheels on the Bus, which is really fundamentally about how Canada can seize this opportunity and use public transit as a tool to cut carbon emissions, but also make everyone's lives a whole lot better. And we partnered with Equita. We also partnered with Dunsky Energy and Climate Advisors, as well as David here on the call from Leading Mobility, who helped them as well, on modeling out, what would it take if Canada took public transit seriously as a tool to reduce carbon emissions and put that in these infrastructure funding deals. And we found that Canada can double public transit ridership by 2035, achieve more than 30% of all travel in major cities being made by public transit, which is doubling overall across Canada from 10 to 20%. Reduce vehicle kilometers traveled by 35% below 2019 level. That's a bit of a nerdy stat, but overall reduce carbon emissions cumulatively over 12 years by 65 million tons. And that's equivalent to roughly the carbon emissions of 20 million cars in 1 year, to put that in perspective. So that's huge. Next slide, please. And to keep it simple, we've modeled essentially 4 big changes in policy. Number 1 is really stepping up funding and expanding transit service and frequency, not just capital funding, but also operating funding. It's the difference between a city being able to use federal funding to buy a new bus or build a new LRT or transit station versus them actually being able to use those vehicles and pay to put them into service with operating funding. That's a really key missing piece. Number 2 is really rolling out bus lanes. We've recommended having funding incentives in that program to encourage cities to deploy that. It includes improving urban planning to encourage more housing density in near transit. Now, that's something we've already won. The federal government did include that, number 3, in their housing plan that came out with the federal budget. So we were really happy to see that, but really the fight isn't over because we still need all these other things, including things like electrifying bus fleets. Next slide, please. So the big political context is that the federal government has promised a new public transit funding program, but they promised it in 2026, which is after the next federal election. And at the meantime, the current program that's been funding public transit since 2016, they've essentially sunset it early. So there's a huge gap between programs where the federal government isn't funding transit at all, including starting in March of 2023. And this is affecting a whole lot of folks, especially here in Toronto, where you have things like the provincial government saying, yeah, we're happy to do our cost share to replace aging subway cars in the TTC, but we'll only pay for it if the federal government comes in with their traditional 40% cost share. So the federal government is essentially hitting the pause button on public transit funding right now in the middle of a climate crisis. And it's really affecting the ability for like the TTC getting funding for things like aging subway cars, which is a real big problem. So as I mentioned earlier, budget 2024 announced that they are going to be adding density requirements to the program, which is great. But again, it's still delayed until 2026, which we're facing a housing crisis right now, which is a significant problem. Transit systems are still have low ridership from the pandemic, and we still have the threat of returning to a downward spiral. That is, I was on the radio today in Quebec, where this is really blown up. Where in Greater Montreal transit systems, they're facing an operating deficit next year of over $560 million, and then the year after that, 600 million. Year after that, up to $700 million in 2028 of a huge gap in their budget, and it's causing a bit of a political firestorm over there right now of how to plug that gap. And we think the federal government should play a strong role in doing that. Next slide, please. So the big problems and this is just really, I'll go over this really quickly, but this is some of the stuff that you can see in our report if you'd like. But one of the big problems is that funding to increase service hours and frequency is, one of the big drivers of increasing ridership, which is obviously good for everybody because it means that there's fewer cars on the road, less traffic, and lower carbon emissions. But federal funding isn't allowed to be used towards that. Fleets have grown, but because of things like COVID and service cuts that happened, there's a lot of buses that could be in service that aren't right now because cities just simply don't have the money to run them. Service levels are actually 7% lower for the average Canadian than they were in 2016 when the federal government started funding public transit. And we're still 40% below the OECD average for public transit use. And we really need to start turning this around. Next slide. And this is obviously has significant consequences. We get headlines like this, where Ottawa gives TTC money for new electric buses, but no funding to operate them. Why hundreds of TTC buses sit idle at rush hour despite millions of government funding. And Toronto can't build new transit on the corpse of what it already has. These are things that we need to be preventing and actually moving towards a more climate safe future by investing better in transit. And we need to be talking to our MPs and letting them know that it's a priority for us. That's it for this slide. And yeah, thanks so much. And I'll pass it back to Felix, I believe.
I'm going to walk you through some of the main points here. So it's easier than you might think. Your member of parliament is actually ready to hear from you. They're elected representatives. They represent their constituency, which is also known as the riding. And if you live in that riding or you're a constituent in that constituency, and you contact your MP and are passionate about an important issue, and are respectfully telling them why it matters to you and your community, they should be willing to set up a meeting with you, especially if you're polite and persistent. So you can find, if you don't know already, or if you want to share this information with other folks in your neighborhood or friends and family, you can just go to this website here, just put in your postal code, and you'll find out who your MP is. You'll find the info for their local office, their constituency office. So getting a hold of them, emailing is great, but we recommend a phone call, which is even better. Just introduce yourself, your name, your postal code if you want. We recommend for setting up a meeting like this, that you identify yourself as a constituent, or if there's a group, the group leader says, I'm calling on behalf of a group of constituents. We're members of the community, because MPs hear often and have meetings often with different advocacy groups and organizations and businesses, which is great, but it can really be impactful when they see that an individual or a group of community members takes the time to show up for a face-to-face meeting for something that they're passionate about. So for some of the details and some types of questions that you can ask, we have that how to meet with your MP about public transit guide documents. You can feel free to ask us any questions about that once you've had a chance to read it too. And then we also have a briefing summary. So some of the main points that Nate touched on already are in there. It's got some facts and some talking points for you to use during the meeting. I'll say that it's always great to tell a little bit of a story too. You can share why public transit in this case matters to you and your community. But that being said, we want the MP ideally in a meeting like this, for it to be successful, to leave with a clear understanding of what our asks are. So it's important to have a guide and some talking points agreed on with your group. Maybe split it up into roles. Maybe one person talks about one thing, another person talks about another thing, and another person takes notes or something like that that works for your team. And then we also recommend doing a quick search, find out what your MP is working on in the community, what they care about. It's a good opportunity to be able to thank them for something cool that they've done, or something that you believe is important, or something you want to see them do more of. As just a way to break the ice and make it a positive interaction at the meeting. So lastly, for a successful meeting, be friendly and foster a positive interaction, right? Make it a conversation, because again, MPs are people. It doesn't have to be scary. Be ready to share, but also to learn and listen. And then that deep breath moment, right? Just be yourself and relax. And don't worry if you don't have all the answers. Believe it or not, MPs don't, expect us to be policy experts, all of us. And you can always say, hey, I don't know the answer to that, but I look forward to getting back to you with more information. And that's also a great way to stay in touch with your MP afterwards. Yeah, remember to take notes. And, as you present this information, you can ask questions like, can we expect a statement or a commitment on this in the future? Or at the very least, is there some way that we can look out for updates and that we can support you in making progress on what we're asking for here? And then taking notes about what they say is a great way to have a trail of those commitments and those conversations, maybe to refer back to later. It's also great if you can ask to take a photo, right? An MP might actually really enjoy being tagged on social media, perhaps with members of their community. And then lastly, we recommend leaving something behind after the meeting that summarizes what was talked about. So in this case, we have linked in the MP guide that was shared, a leave behind document. So it's kind of a brief policy summary designed to be looked at by the MP, that has some of the recommendations that we're bringing forward for them to bring to the federal government for advancing public transit funding, because we all know, all of us on this call, that it can't wait and it needs to happen now. And we want to make sure that our MPs know that as well. So that being said, I want to turn things over before we get into any questions, to our special guests today, I will stop sharing my screen. I will briefly introduce Shelagh, who many of you know. Shelagh Pizey Allen, the Executive Director of TTC Riders, the leading advocacy organization in Toronto for the TTC. And she'll be talking with David Cooper from Leading Mobility, who's worked as a transit planner and worked in transit agencies in cities all across the country. So I will pass it over to both of you.
Yes, please come gather around our virtual fire for this chat. I'm so excited to chat with David and also everyone here on this call because, I recognize some of your names and some of you I don't know, but I do know there's a lot of experience in this room when it comes to activism and meeting with your MPs. So I just, have some questions I'm going to ask David about his experience. And for people that don't know David, the reason I'm so excited is that, David has worked for Canadian Urban Transit Association. He's worked for TTC, so he really has this insider's view. And sometimes as activists, we don't always understand what's motivating MPs, what's effective or not. So I'm excited to kind of get his take. And before I jump in, David, I guess I just wanted to speak a little bit about TTC riders and our experience talking to MPs and elected officials. Like I think there are people that are easy to convince or they might already be on our side. And then there's people that are harder to convince. But in each case, you really do need to bring constituents from their riding. That's who they need to listen to because that's they need people's votes to get reelected. And even on this issue of federal funding, I've found meeting with MPs, some of them are so supportive and they're actually grateful that we meet with them because then it lets them go and advocate to the finance minister and say, look, I've heard from my constituents about this. So that's quite encouraging, actually. So yeah, are you ready, David, to have me ask you a couple of questions about your work?
Maybe elaborate on just my background. So I've worked in transit agencies for 14 years with Calgary Transit, TransLink in Vancouver, and the City of Toronto on TTC projects. So definitely will give you a cross-country view and been working with them as a consultant for 5 years. So a lot of the work is interfacing with the politics of transit and helping to shepherd some of the decision making and really trying to convince our political decision makers, but also really bolster the conversation of the benefit of public transit in cities of all shapes and sizes across the country. So quite excited to have this conversation with Shelagh and also props to TTC riders, like the amount of amazing advocacy and just dialogue that they have and just also just recognition of a lot of these key issues, I think is quite awesome. And I'm really glad to see Shelagh and the broader team bring forward these conversations of transit funding and the importance of transit across Toronto.
Yeah, and shout out to everyone who's here on this call from TTC Riders. We're a membership-based organization. All our campaigns are led by volunteers and people on this call. So I guess my first question for you, David, is, in your work, you've worked in different sides and elements of these systems, but in your work with transit systems and projects across the country, what have you learned about, the impact that engaged residents can have on public transit? Like, how have you seen that have an impact?
So one of the really great things about transit, at least in the realm of planning, and the role that I play, is that the people that plan and design the systems, you're impacting something that someone relies on every day, and you don't usually get that in the realm of planning cities, right? You make it a service decision or an investment decision. There's thousands of people that rely on that, or if you change or revise that to make it better, or sometimes adjust it, it might make it worse. Like there's pretty significant individual implications to that. One of the things that is vitally important for us from a transit perspective is having engaged residents and riders telling us what is working and what's not working. Because at the end of the day, we have to come up with a series of priorities that really meets the needs of our customers, but also try to attract new riders, try to maintain the lifeline of services that we have for many types of riders that we have. And we can't do that if we don't hear from members of the public, members in the community, people who rely on these services every day. And if they're not engaged with the political decision makers, because at the end of the day, at budget time, like a great time to have that conversation is when the city budget's being deliberated. And also the conversation of what's the role of the province and the federal government on that is a huge part of that conversation. Engaged residents set the priorities of the table. And, I can come up with every technical solution possible to say, okay, this is a way that we could build a new line here or make things better on the service over there. But if you don't tell me if that's actually going to work for you, then we're a bit blind. And I think having the engaged residents on that is quite important. The benefits of transit is pretty widely understood, I think, by members of the public, by the business community, by NGOs, stakeholders, and other groups, and by politicians. When transit's working and when it's not working. We have a unplanned subway disruption on line 2, and you see thousands of people spilling out on Bloor Street onto shuttle buses. It's a very evident thing when things aren't working, but then when things are working and you're seeing people that can make a life decision by not getting a second car or purchasing a home close to transit and having that service available for them, that is something that we do see the benefits of. And one of the things that's also interesting with transit is that support has actually come across party lines. I don't have a lot of pretty big philosophical debates with the conservatives. I don't have philosophical debates about transit with the liberals. I think or the NDP. I think what happens is that people may differ on what project might be one party over the other, but they're not actually debating should transit be funded, at least from a capital side. And that's something, maybe the levels of it might be a bit different by government and where they are, from a provincial or federal perspective, but they're not typically saying, oh, we don't want to fund this. It's more, what is the priority of what we should fund or how we should fund, or the sequencing of it is more the question versus is it a government priority or not? And we're not seeing that from across party lines, which has been quite interesting to see for the last several years.
Yeah, you're right. And I mean, I guess that's why we're all here today, right? That we know there's support for transit capital projects, but what we're trying to do is really change how transit is funded and ask the federal government to get into the business of funding operations so we can make service more frequent and more affordable. And so thinking about that goal, in your experience of, you met with lots of politicians, with mayors, councillors, what kind of transit issues do you think politicians, enjoy hearing about, or what do they need to hear more of from the public to, maybe really drive our point home on this?
There is a challenge. Politicians love the big ticket capital projects, cutting a ribbon on a new line or, introducing a shiny new electric bus is definitely a lot more appealing for a photo op, and you do get benefits from that. But one thing I've been really pushing with, senior staff in the federal government, but also with politicians, is that you don't get the outcomes if you don't have service. You could, like one of my favorite headlines was the one that Lex Harvey put in for the Toronto Star about, we're getting the funding for the electric buses, but no money to run them. And like that speaks to a critical issue. If you're not actually running the service, you're not getting the GHG reductions, you're not, if you're not providing the operating funding when you turn on a new capital project, you're providing a minimum level of, excellent service, you're not going to get the housing outcomes with the project, and I think really tying these things to other objectives of the government is huge. Right now, if you want to get people's attention, talk about housing. My conversation on that right now is that you're not going to get the housing opportunities if you don't have the service. Like that's just a given, right? So people are not going to build on transit lines if a bus comes every half an hour or 45 minutes or not at all for certain parts of the day, or you have a train line that runs minimal or limited service because we don't have the money to run it. And that is something that's quite keen. One of the things that does concern me is we have a perfect storm right now. We had a whole missing generation of transit investment where, you could see that on the TTC subway network. There wasn't anything built for, open for 15 years. We saw that in cities like Calgary, there was 10 years of nothing that opened. Edmonton had about 14 years without an extension. And so now we're having all these new projects coming online, but their existing systems are now life cycling. So it's one thing for us to say, hey, we need to get money for new lines and services, but we actually need the operating money to keep the lights on of our existing systems. You walk into a Toronto subway station, a lot of them don't have roofs right now. because we're doing state of good repair projects on infrastructure that's 50, 60, 70 years old. A switch goes out, we have some pretty significant implications on that. And we're seeing that across the country where the original systems are now life cycling. We're now opening new systems and we're trying to find the money to actually do both. And this is going to be such a critical issue that people will need to say, okay, it's not just for obviously putting in the expansion dollars to run the service, have a good service, but also we actually need some operating funding to maintain what we have, because when it doesn't work, you will find out very quickly what happens when it doesn't work. So, and that's been a key critical issue across the country.
Yeah, and I think that's a good example we can bring up here in Toronto. It's really a safety issue, right? It was just on March 1st, really recently, that the TTC had to shut down the subway during rush hour to complete an emergency repair because there was a cracked switch rail, and that's not normal. And that is an operating expense to conduct that preventative maintenance work on the subway. So that might be, if we're thinking about how do we convince MPs, there's some examples like that. I wanted to get into some questions, because when you meet with MPs, some of them may welcome your meeting and, agree with you and say, yeah, I'm going to bring this to the finance minister, but others, can get quite defensive. And, I've heard this a lot that, they'll kind of trot out, well, here's all the great investments we've made. How dare you say we're not doing enough, basically. So what would be your advice if an MP that you're meeting with says, well, the federal government has already invested enough, or, kind of run through the list of things they've already funded?
Yeah, and that's a difficult one because there has been increased investment. Like I remember when I started my career, it was during the Harper era. And one of the complaints that was made to some of the agencies was that, sometimes people were not acknowledging the investments that were coming in. And what was actually interesting was the Harper government actually changed the equation on the transit capital and started investing significantly in transit capital, which then obviously expanded over time, in more recent years. But, if you go into a meeting and you start criticizing somebody for saying you're not doing enough versus actually saying, okay, we do appreciate, we do have new, there's a much newer bus fleet on the streets. We have a brand new streetcar network right now from the fleet perspective. We are starting to see the benefit of some of these investments. Yes, like acknowledge that. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think what'll end up happening is that, if you don't actually sustain investment, and this isn't anything from housing or healthcare or transit, what ends up happening is you don't get the benefits down the road, or you get the disbenefits of things, right? The Line 2 subway cars is my favorite example right now. We've had investments across the rest of the subway system, but we have a line that carries 500,000 people that spans several federal and provincial ridings. And right now we have a funding partner that hasn't put forward the funds on a mission critical piece of infrastructure. There are things that, part of the conversation, I think, is what's a nice to have versus what's a need to have. And some of the need to haves right now are not funded. That is probably one of the best examples in the country right now from a local perspective. Like we need to replace those subway cars. They are a lifeline to the overall city. But I think acknowledging what has been done, I think, is always good, from any perspective. You go into any conversation, I think people will appreciate that. But at the end of the day, like, if you don't sustain support into something that is a significant public good, it starts eroding and degrading really quickly. And that's something that is at risk on transit. And if people don't see that, they will see the implications of that in things that will happen on a service day unexpected, and things that will be really unfortunate, and people will point a finger and blame, and I don't think they want to be in the receiving end of that either. So
Yeah, I mean, we just saw the Scarborough RT derail this summer, right? And preventive maintenance had been reduced. That was reported by the external consultants that investigated the derailment. So, I think that it's not to fearmonger or say the Line 2 subway line is anywhere near that stage, but just, to emphasize the importance of maintaining the systems that we already do have. Another common refrain when we meet with MPs is that they'll say that transit is actually a provincial and municipal responsibility. And I wonder if you have any good sort of responses to that have worked for you.
I I just recently taught a class on planning policy, and I don't want to go into constitutional, looking at the Constitution and who does what. But I feel it does rear its head on that when we look at the Canadian Constitution and the levels of government. At the end of the day, the federal government has the ability to fund things of significant infrastructure levels that even provinces and cities can't. Well, cities just can't. Cities are pretty strapped when it comes to long-term capital planning, when it comes to overall municipal finance, because they aren't given the tools, mostly from the province actually, to actually sustain any sort of significant capital funding or ability to raise these funds. We've had some examples where we do have some, development cost charges in some cities. We've had, things like a city building fund in Toronto, but they don't have the ability to actually raise the revenue or the capital that you need to actually do these substantial investments when it comes to electrification, when it comes to building new lines, when it comes to renewing your fleet or anything like that without the federal government. So that is something that when we look at G7 countries, the federal government not only provides capital, but they actually provide operating, because there's a number of differing policy outcomes that transit agencies provide from a social and economic perspective, an equity perspective that aligns with their policy priorities as a national government. So it doesn't hold water to say like, hey, like this is not something that is our purview. It actually quite is. And I don't think it's something that they can walk out of either. But at the end of the day, like they have the financial abilities overall to do substantial investments in this, because the cities don't have the ability to do that. And that's of the doing of the federal and provincial government.
Totally. And maybe one thing I'll share that came up in one of our MP meetings just last month was that, to your point about recognizing what the government has already done. We said, oh, we're so excited that you've announced the permanent public transit fund. So awesome. But, we think it should be accelerated. 2 years away is too far away. And also, what about giving municipalities the flexibility to use it for operations funding? So instead of saying, oh, we want you to create this whole new funding stream and you need to do X, Y, and Z, you're already doing this program. Can't you just make it a bit more flexible? And the MP was quite receptive to that idea. Maybe, and I think we can get into all the other ideas people have to kind of be convincing in these arguments. But I did have one last question that I think I hear a lot from people, that it can be quite frustrating when we put the effort into meeting with an MP, getting petitions signed, and we don't see results right away. And I know in our own experience at TTC Riders, we know that campaigns can take years. Like, for example, convincing City Council to convert the Scarborough RT rail line after its decommissioning into a busway took us 3 years to convince them to do it and to fund it. I mean, it's still not done. We'll celebrate when it's actually built, but even convincing them to approve that plan took a long time. So, as someone who's kind of talking to maybe politicians more regularly and seeing things from a different perspective, should we be discouraged if we don't see immediate results? Or, what are some ingredients that make advocacy successful beyond just, one MP meeting?
I might go on a tangent deliberately for a second and dive into that. I think the first part is, the concept of permanent transit fund is actually quite helpful. Like cities have wanted for a very long time the certainty of cash flow, the certainty of saying, okay, if we know there's $3 billion a year, we know what the requirements are and the criteria are for this. We can come up with a long-term plan and see what we can actually advance in the realm of opportunity with also our provincial partners on that. I think that's huge and something that I think will be very beneficial to many. I think, the conversation of using some of that fund for operating, like I push that forward. I'll give an example from Calgary, like the Green Line LRT, the first phase from Southeast Calgary to downtown is a it's $38 million operating per year, but the bus service it's replacing is $7 million. So we have $31 million per year in operating that we got to go find. But it takes time for people to shift over to new service. It takes time for housing to be built along the line. So like, is there an ability for the federal government to provide some sort of operating support on these new projects that they're funding to at least have an off ramp down the road? Like, I think we need to start being creative with some of these opportunities and these discussions when it comes to funding on some of this. I think from, the conversation of bringing up kind of these local issues we need federal support on, like one thing that is, I think people need to keep in mind, like when people come to a politician, people come with different, topics. It could be from housing, healthcare, environment, economy, social justice, transit, all these things. I think having a very consistent, like sustained message is vital, because when you're coming up to a person and you say, okay, here's the benefits of what we're trying to achieve for your community, and also the benefits of what we're trying to achieve against your agenda, and having a sustained message is quite important, because at the end of the day, there's a lot of people asking for a lot of things, and if you can keep the message consistent, I think that's quite vitally important. One thing too is that, as much as the federal government represents the whole country, there's 338 ridings, and it's a first past the post system. So there's local issues that influence races. And we have an election that's coming up, and I'm going to pick on line 2 subway cars again. Like, we have those subway cars run through the entire city through at least over a dozen ridings. Like, there is something that's mission critical about some of these investments that we need some support on. And if you actually localize the issues with that particular MP, you get more of an audience, I find, or with that local decision maker. And the other thing, when it comes to the federal election and politics, the key sway areas when you win elections is the 905, suburban city of Toronto, suburban Vancouver. So I'm talking about Langley, I'm talking about Surrey and others. And what's very interesting about some of these areas, even some parts of the prairie cities in the suburban parts, they're hungry for transit. They want transit investment. There's a $4 billion SkyTrain line going through a bunch of what I would say swing seats right now through suburban Vancouver. We have a massive transit capital program going through the 905 right now. I don't think, when we see ridership recovery, Brampton is just beating everyone when it comes to ridership recovery. Suburban Vancouver is like nearing 120% ridership recovery. These are swing seats, swing areas for the federal government. So I think there is an interesting narrative and message when it comes to federal support and investment in these particular areas when you localize the issues, but then you also kind of see the macro issues occurring around them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the theory partly of what we're trying to do here, and why this is such a critical window for us to win these policy changes, is that, we hope to, through meeting with MPs and other actions, and I think I'll post, maybe I can take this moment to just post one in the chat, that today's Wednesday evening, tomorrow morning, Thursday, TTC Riders volunteers are going to deliver a big fund evasion ticket to Minister Chrystia Freeland. Yeah, because MPs have committed fund evasion. They haven't chipped in yet for the new subway trains. They haven't sped up the permanent transit fund. So we want to find creative ways to ask our MPs to make transit a priority in this important window. And meeting with MPs is a really important one as well.
Yeah, and I'll say some of the briefing documents that have like Q&A stuff, like commonly like some of the stuff that David and Shelagh were talking about oh, we've already made all these investments, why should we continue to invest in transit, like stuff like that. There's a lot of these common questions that come up, and we do have answers for each of them. And we also have a leave behind that will be helping folks print out for these meetings. It's the one I use myself when I meet with federal officials, and it's got a link to our report on it. So if there's any major questions, they're likely already answered by the report. So you can always say, hey, check out the report, right? So it's very long. It's like over 50 pages. We don't expect everybody to read it. Which is why we have the one page leave behind.
Yeah, again, we'll share all of that information with you all. And I believe if it's not in the chat already, we can drop in that sign up form where you can say where you're located, and if you want to team up with a group of other folks who are interested in setting up these meetings, or if you're interested in leading a group, maybe you know some other folks too, and you want to get together some of these talking points. You're not alone. If you have any questions about any of these talking points too, you can reach out. You'll receive in the email folks to speak to. We can set up another phone call if you like. We hope to do more of these sessions as well. Are there any other questions from folks? In case folks are taking a minute to think about that. I'm wondering if there's anything that we should avoid when we meet with our MPs. I don't know if Shelagh or David wants to touch on that. Is there anything that we should avoid at a meeting with a elected official?
I think at the end of the day, like, and this is with any elected official, like if you keep the conversation respectful and thoughtful, you're always going to have an audience. If you take a run at someone, like, and you're not respectful, you don't have an audience. And I think that's one thing that, you know, you kind of see time and time again. And like, there's things where I think people will see, you know, joint interests and joint benefits on things. And sometimes you may walk from a meeting and say, maybe I felt like I was heard. And sometimes if you leave the meeting thinking that it didn't go anywhere, it doesn't mean the mission or the, you know, the mission is over on that, right? Like there's still, you know, at the end of the day, you know, transit funding is not cheap, and these are pretty significant investments with everything that's going on, and it's a sustained conversation. But I think if you do it in a very thoughtful, deliberate, and you know, outcomes-based conversation, I think you'll actually get a lot further than you think.
I guess I'll turn it on to some next steps now. I mean, the main next step is if everyone wants to sign up through that form. Yeah, so fill out the form. We'll send you all of the guides and materials. And we're suggesting at this point that the third week of May is a time to aim for potentially. You know, we can't promise anyone's availability, and sustained meetings throughout the year are great, but that's a time when your MP should be back in their local office. Gives them a month from today to find some time in their schedule. Gives everyone a month to put their teams together. And you can feel free to reach out to either TTC Riders or us here at Environmental Defense. The email there is engagement@environmentaldefense.ca if you have any other questions or want to hop on a call with anyone. So thanks again to everyone for joining us. Thank you to David. Thank you to Shelagh. Thanks for the context from Nate. We really appreciate working with TTC Riders and all of the great volunteers who are on this call. It's so great to meet all of you. So great to meet everyone and see everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. You'll hear from us shortly, as well as hopefully a group leader or some other folks in your community. And again, stay in touch. And yeah, we look forward to working together. The wheels are turning. You know, we've sent in letters. We've made phone calls to the federal government. We want this funding to be accelerated. It can't wait. There's that great action happening tomorrow with TTC Riders in Toronto, and we'll be sending out opportunities for further events, for further moments to you and to everyone who's involved in this movement. And hope that everyone has a great evening, and we will talk to you soon.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you, Felix.